I want to tell you something I've never said out loud before. Not to my friends, not to my pastor, not even to the one person who deserved to hear it most. I want to tell you what I did in the quiet months before everything fell apart, when nobody was watching and nobody thought to ask. I revised my trust. I restructured everything. And I did it without breathing a single word to my son, my daughter, or anyone connected to them. When they finally showed up at my door with their spreadsheets and their entitlement and their careful smiles, my attorney had already been to my home twice. The paperwork was signed, the deed was transferred, and there was nothing left for them to take. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. I am 68 years old. I live in a white farmhouse outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, on 4 acres my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1987 for less than what a used car costs today. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse, mostly in labor and delivery. I held thousands of babies in this world. I held hands when people died. I drove home at 2 in the morning smelling like antiseptic and ate cold leftovers over the sink and got up and did it again because that was what our family needed. Gerald worked construction. We were not wealthy people, but we were deliberate people. Every dollar had a purpose. Every sacrifice had a reason. We raised 2 children in that farmhouse. My son is 51 now. My daughter is 48. They grew up with clean clothes and full plates and family vacations to Gatlinburg every summer. They grew up knowing their parents would show up, knowing that whatever happened, we would be there. Gerald died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend much time on that because even now it costs me something to say it plainly. What I will tell you is that in those 11 weeks, my son visited twice. My daughter came once for a single weekend and spent half of it on her phone in the back bedroom. I was the one who drove him to every appointment. I was the one who learned what a PICC line was and how to manage it at home. I was the one who sat with him at 4 in the morning when the pain medication wore off and there was nothing to do but hold his hand and pray. After Gerald passed, my son called to ask about the will before the funeral arrangements were finalized. I told myself he was grieving in his own way. I told myself people handle loss differently. I told myself that because the alternative, believing what I was actually seeing, was too painful to sit with. Here is what I know now that I wish I had understood then. When someone shows you who they are in a moment of crisis, believe them. Don't explain it away. Don't soften it with excuses. Look at what they do when the stakes are real, and believe what you see. The years after Gerald died were the loneliest of my life. I had retired by then, which I thought would feel like freedom but mostly felt like silence. My son lives 40 minutes away in a new construction neighborhood with a homeowners association and a 3-car garage. My daughter lives in Charlotte with her husband and their 2 boys. I have 3 grandchildren. I have seen fewer than a dozen times in the past 4 years. I want to be careful here because I don't want your sympathy for the sake of it. I want you to understand the context. I want you to understand what I was working with, what I had given, and what I received in return. When my daughter-in-law decided she wanted to go back to graduate school 3 years ago, I wrote a check for $14,000 to cover her first year's tuition so they wouldn't have to take out loans. My son called it a loan at first. Then, he stopped mentioning it. It was never repaid, and I never asked, because you don't ask your children to pay back kindness. You just quietly note that kindness was received and not acknowledged. When my daughter's younger boy had to repeat 2nd grade and needed 2 years of private tutoring, I paid for the tutoring. Every session, every summer program, every assessment, somewhere around $9,000 over those 2 years. My daughter sent a Venmo thank you once with 3 heart emojis. That was the extent of it. When my son lost his contracting business during a rough year and couldn't make his mortgage, I covered 4 months of payments without him having to ask twice. $1,600 a month. I watched my savings account and I told myself, this is what mothers do. This is what family means. But the cabin is where the real story begins. Gerald and I bought a cabin in the Smoky Mountains in 2003. It took us 8 years to pay it off. It sits on a mountain ridge outside of Townsend, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a wood-burning fireplace that Gerald installed himself over a long November weekend. We spent every anniversary there. We took the grandchildren there when they were small enough to still want to come. After Gerald died, I kept it because it was the last place in the world where I could still feel him close. I sit on that porch in the mornings and drink my coffee, and I talk to him sometimes, which I suppose sounds eccentric, but grief has its own logic. My son had been making comments about the cabin for about 2 years. Small things at first, offhand remarks. How much was it worth now, with the way mountain property had gone up? Whether I'd thought about what would happen to it. Whether I really needed to hold on to a second property at my age. I deflected every time. I changed the subject or gave a vague answer and moved on. What I didn't know, what I pieced together later, was that my son and daughter had been having their own separate conversations about my property for quite some time. I found this out the way you find most things out when your family is keeping secrets from you, by accident. My grandnephew, my late sister Patricia's grandson, is 22 years old and does landscaping work on my property a few times a year. He came by on a Thursday in October to winterize my flower beds, and while I was bringing him sweet tea, he said, without any preamble, "Aunt Dorothy," my mom said, "to tell you she's thinking about you." I thanked him and asked how his mother was doing, my niece Claire, and he got a little quiet and then said, "She's okay. She's just been a little upset since she ran into your son at the hardware store a few weeks ago and he said some things." I asked him what kind of things. He was careful. He's a kind young man. But eventually he told me that my son had said, in what I can only imagine was casual conversation in the lumber aisle, that the cabin was basically going to the family anyway when Mom passes, and that Claire shouldn't get any ideas. I set the pitcher of sweet tea down on the porch railing very slowly. Claire is the daughter of my sister Patricia, who died 4 years ago from complications after a stroke. Claire and I had grown close in those final years of Patricia's illness. She was the one who called me from the hospital. She was the one who sat across from me at the kitchen table after the funeral when the casseroles were gone and the visitors had left, and we were just 2 women who had loved the same person and were learning how to live without her. Claire had driven down from Asheville 3 times in the past year just to check on me. She brought food. She sat with me. She never once asked me for anything. My son had never met Claire more than twice in his life. I thanked my grandnephew for telling me and went inside and sat in Gerald's armchair in the living room for a very long time. 2 weeks after that conversation, my daughter called on a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of making soup. She said she had been thinking and she wanted to talk about some practical matters regarding my estate and would I be available for a family conversation the following Saturday. She used the word estate. She said it carefully, the way people say a word they've been rehearsing. I said Saturday was fine. On Wednesday, I called my attorney. His name is Walter, and he's been handling my family's legal matters since Gerald and I bought the cabin. He's in his early 70s, semi-retired, sharp as a new blade, and he does not waste words. I told him what had been happening. I told him about the hardware store conversation. I told him about the comments about the cabin's value. I told him about the tuition and the mortgage payments and the wedding gifts and the years of watching my grandchildren through photographs on an app because visiting was inconvenient. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dorothy, what do you want to happen?" I said I wanted to make sure the cabin went to someone who understood what it meant. Someone who had earned that understanding not through inheritance but through presence. He said, "Then let's make sure that happens before Saturday." I want to pause here and tell you something that the top comment on a video I watched recently said and which I think is the most practically useful thing I can share. A trust is different from a will. A will goes through probate, which is a court process, and during that process, it can be contested and delayed and complicated. A trust, when properly structured, transfers assets directly. It does not go through probate. It is much harder to challenge. If you are a woman of a certain age and you have property, and you have people in your life who are watching that property with calculating eyes, please talk to an estate attorney. Not someday. Soon. The best protection you can give yourself is quiet, legal, and done before anyone knows to object. Walter came to my house on Thursday evening. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of decaf and went through everything. I had already thought it through, but hearing it in legal language made it real in a way that felt like both grief and relief at the same time. I restructured my living trust. I designated the cabin to Claire, outright, with a letter of intent explaining why. I adjusted the remainder of my estate in ways I won't detail here because some things are still private. Walter left at 9 o'clock. I stood in the kitchen after he left and looked at the framed cross-stitch above the sink that Gerald's mother had made for us when we got married. It says, "Home is where love is." I had always believed that. I still do. I've just become more particular about what love looks like in practice. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of November morning that makes you want to stay in your bathrobe. I did not stay in my bathrobe. I put on my good wool cardigan, the dark green one, and I made a proper breakfast, and I called Claire that morning just to hear her voice. She asked how I was doing. I said I was doing fine. She said she'd been thinking about me, and had I had a chance to get out to the cabin recently. I said I hadn't, but I was planning to go in the spring. She said she'd love to come with me sometime. I said I'd like that very much. My son and daughter arrived at 11. My daughter-in-law did not come, which surprised me until I realized it probably meant they had agreed someone should stay removed from the conversation. My daughter had driven up from Charlotte the night before and stayed at my son's house. They came in together, which was itself a small signal. They stamped the cold off their boots and I gave them coffee and we sat in the living room. My son started. He said that he and his sister had been doing a lot of thinking and that at their ages and mine, it was important to have clear plans in place. He said he wanted to make sure I wasn't carrying unnecessary burdens. He said the word burden the way my daughter had said the word estate, carefully, rehearsed. My daughter nodded and said that the cabin especially was a significant asset, and that maintaining a second property on a fixed income was a real responsibility, and had I thought about whether it made sense to simplify. I said I had thought about it quite a bit, actually. My son said that he and his sister had talked to someone, a financial advisor, who had suggested that transferring certain assets sooner rather than later could have tax advantages for everyone involved. He said everyone involved the way you say something when you mean yourself. Then he took a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the coffee table. I looked at it, but I didn't touch it. He said it was just some preliminary thoughts, nothing formal, just a starting point for conversation. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a handwritten list. At the top it said, "Cabin transfer to joint ownership, David and Susan. David is my son, Susan is my daughter." Below that it said, "POA, consider updating to include both children." Below that it said, "Bank accounts discuss beneficiary designations." I read it twice. I set it back down on the coffee table. The room was very quiet. My daughter said, "Mom, we just want to make sure everything is in order. We want to protect you." I thought about Gerald driving home from a 12-hour shift with concrete dust in his hair so we could make the mortgage payment. I thought about 31 years of night shifts and holiday shifts and covering for colleagues who had young children when mine were young too, because the bills did not pause. I thought about sitting at this same coffee table across from my son when he was 34 years old and his business was failing, and I wrote him a check without hesitation because he was my child and I believed in being there for your children. I thought about the hardware store conversation. I thought about the word estate. I thought about the word burden. I said, "I appreciate that you're thinking about me." My son leaned forward a little. He said, "So you'd be open to talking through some of these things?" I said, "I've already handled it." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I met with my attorney on Thursday. I've restructured my trust. Everything is in order." There was a pause. My daughter looked at my son. My son looked at the piece of paper on the coffee table. He said, "Well, we'd want to be involved in those conversations going forward, Mom, just to make sure." I said, "There aren't any conversations going forward. It's done." Walter handled it. It's signed, and it's filed. The cabin is taken care of. My daughter said, "Taken care of how?" I said, "I've left it to someone who will love it the way Gerald and I loved it." Another pause. Longer this time. My son said, Someone. What does that mean? I said, It means exactly what it sounds like. He said, Mom, are you telling me you've given the cabin away to someone outside the family? I said Claire was family. I said she was the daughter of my sister, who I loved more than most things in this life. I said that Claire had sat with me through grief and had called just to check in and had never once asked me for anything, and that those things matter more than proximity on a family tree. My son stood up. He didn't shout. He was raised better than that, which I will give him credit for. But his voice changed. He said this was impulsive and that I should have talked to them first, and that he couldn't believe I had made a decision this significant without consulting my own children. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, David, when your father was dying, you visited twice. When I called your sister to tell her he'd had a bad night, she came once and spent Saturday afternoon on her phone. When I was learning to manage his medications and driving him to Knoxville every week for treatment, neither of you offered to take a single appointment. I handled all of it, alone. The room was quiet again. I said, I paid for your wife's first year of graduate school. I paid for your sister's son to have 2 years of private tutoring. I covered 4 months of your mortgage when your business was struggling. I did all of those things because you are my children, and I loved you, and I believed that love moved in both directions. My daughter said, Mom, that's not fair. I said, I'm not finished. She went quiet. I said, what's not fair is finding out from a 22-year-old boy that my son told someone in a hardware store that my cabin was basically going to the family anyway, as though I were already gone. What's not fair is sitting here looking at a handwritten list of my assets that you brought to my home as though this were a business meeting. I am not a business. I am your mother, and I am still here. Neither of them said anything. I said, I love you both. That hasn't changed, and it won't. But I handled my affairs the way I saw fit, and they are handled, and they are not going to be revisited. My son picked up his jacket from the arm of the sofa. He said he needed some air. He went out to the front porch. My daughter stayed. She looked at her hands for a long moment, and then she looked at me and I saw something flicker across her face that I hadn't seen in years. Something younger. Something that looked almost like the girl who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long car rides. She said, quietly, Did we really make you feel that invisible? It was the only honest thing either of them had said since they walked through my door. I said, Yes, you did. She didn't apologize. Not that day. She cried a little, which felt more real than anything else. And then she got her coat and went to find her brother, and they drove away, and I sat in Gerald's armchair in the quiet house and I breathed. I want to tell you what happened after, because I know that's what you're wondering. My son sent a text the following week that said he thought I had made a hasty decision and hoped I would reconsider. Did not respond to that specific sentence. I told him I loved him and that I hoped he and his family were well. He did not respond to that. My daughter called 3 weeks later. The conversation was different from the ones we'd been having. She didn't perform. She just talked. She told me she'd been thinking about what I said and that she didn't have a good defense. I said I wasn't asking for a defense. I said I was still her mother and I still wanted to know her children. She said she wanted that too. We have talked 4 times since then. They are careful conversations with rough edges, but they are real ones. That matters to me. Claire does not know yet about the cabin. I will tell her in the spring, when we go up together and sit on the porch and drink our coffee and watch the fog lift off the ridge the way it does on mountain mornings. I will tell her then because I want to see her face in that place, in the light Gerald loved. When she finds out, I want her to understand not just what she's receiving, but what it means. Some people have asked me, when I've talked about any of this with friends who've been through similar things, whether I feel guilty, whether I worry I've damaged something that can't be repaired. Here is what I have come to understand after 68 years, 31 of them as a nurse, 6 of them as a widow, and a lifetime as someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. Guilt is appropriate when you have done something wrong. Grief is appropriate when something is lost that mattered. But clarity, choosing yourself when no one else has, protecting what you have built and what you have loved, there is nothing to be guilty about in that. The grief is real. I grieve the relationship I thought I had with my children. I grieve the version of this family that existed only in my imagination. That grief belongs to me and it is legitimate. But I do not regret what I did. Not for a single moment. I go to the cabin when I can. I sit on the porch in the cold mornings and drink my coffee and talk to Gerald the way I always have. I tell him about Claire and how much she reminds me of Patricia sometimes, the way she tilts her head when she's listening. I tell him the property is still standing and the woodwork he did on the fireplace mantel is holding up beautifully. I tell him I am all right. The cabin sits on that mountain ridge and waits the way good things wait, without urgency, without demand, in the simple and patient certainty of its own worth. It is waiting for someone who will know what to do with it. Someone who will sit on that porch and breathe that air and feel the weight of what it means to be given something real. It is waiting for Claire, and in making sure of that, in walking quietly into my attorney's office and doing what needed to be done before anyone thought to stop me, I gave myself something I had not felt in a very long time. I gave myself back to myself. I handled it. And I would handle it the same way again.